What is Sub-Saharan Africa? Well, first let's start with Africa. First off, Africa is not a country. Africa is a massive continent. Africa is the second largest continent in the world, right after Asia. Now, if we look at Africa, Africa actually has 54 countries in it. That's by the United Nations records. So 54 countries, which means there's more countries in Africa than any continent in the world. In addition to this, if we look at the population of Africa, there are 1 billion people who live in Africa, in the whole continent. 1 billion. So if we take a look at that, there are 7 billion people who live in the world. So we can see that 1 out of 7 people in the world today are Africans. Now, this doesn't include African Americans. Many of the African people who live in people who are originally from Africa but now live in Brazil, Caribbean, Haiti, Jamaica. This is just Africa. People who live in Africa right now, it's 1 billion. And the amazing thing is that Africa is growing at a very fast rate for population. By the year 2050, there will be 2 billion Africans in the world. So, Africa is only going to grow in importance as it grows in population. Also, if we look at economy, now many students, when we mentioned Africa, what do you think of? Many of you said poverty, and there is a lot of poverty in Africa. There's a lot of places where there's war-torn countries, so there is poverty in Africa. However, if we look at it, some of the fastest growing economies in the world, that means the places where the jobs are growing, where the things are getting better, are in Africa. I believe the estimate is that 6 of the 10 of the fastest growing economies in the world are African countries right now. So we're going to split up Africa in two, though, for this unit. I want you to look at the red section right here. And if you look right here, this is what we would call Saharan Africa. Saharan Africa. Because this red part's the Sahara Desert. So this northern part is the Sahara Desert. We would call this Saharan Africa. Now, if I'm looking at this part of Africa, I'm looking at my climate map right here. One thing I notice is that this part of Africa, there's a lot of different climates. South, that we get the blue, we get the greens, there's rainforest, savanna, even some desert down here. Here it's red. What that means is this is more of a uniform climate region or a uniform geography. This is the Sahara Desert. Mainly it's hot, it's dry. And also, the people are a little more uniform, which means they're more similar than different. So what that means is a lot of people who live in this area, many of them are Muslim for religion. Not all, but many of them are Muslim. And if we think about a lot of people who live, especially like in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, up in this region, we see a lot of people who we wouldn't, if we look at them like along ethnic lines about like skin tone, for example, we wouldn't, think of them as typically many of them as darker. If we were going to take all the people in the world, you put like the darkest people on one side, the lightest people on the other, these people might land somewhere in the middle. I remember Miss Herbert in one of our classes said that if you're going to look at like skin tone of these people, they'd probably look like someone from Ecuador. Dark hair, dark skin, a medium toned skin would be right here. This would be Saharan Africa, where people, I would say, are more similar than different. It doesn't mean they're all the same, but more similar than different. Now, if we get down in this region right here, this would be what we'd call Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, which this region here is a lot more diverse, I would say. Here you have, many different climate regions, many different kinds of people, many different religions. You have a lot of Christians, and you have a lot of Muslims. You have a lot of people who believe in traditional religions. Down here, you would even see some people who in South Africa who are Hindu. You would see there are some people from China who live in some of these regions. Madagascar has people who might resemble people more from, parts of Asia than Africa. So it is a pretty diverse area. Also, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of languages spoken in this area. If you would take your average sub-Saharan African, they probably speak 3 languages. The average person does. They probably, have like a native language they speak. Maybe they have 2 native languages from Africa, which are a more traditional language. And then they might have a colonial language like French and English, possibly a German. And if they're in America, probably have English too, if they have like French or German along with that. So you see that there's many people who speak 3, 4 languages. I have a friend from the Ivory Coast who mostly speaks two languages, French and English. He would actually be in the minority. He doesn't speak as much of the native language of his family, but he speaks two languages, and that's actually few for that. Where in America, speaking two languages is, for some people see that as exceptional. So here in Saharan Africa, we probably see more people speaking Arabic. Now there are many other languages too, but many of them speak Arabic. Where around here we see hundreds and hundreds of languages. Now there are other languages spoken in the Sahara region of Africa, but I'd say Sub-Saharan has more. And also if we look at this one over here, the different countries, most of the 54 countries are located in Sub-Saharan Africa. It's also a bigger region. So we're going to focus our unit on Sub-Saharan Africa. If I made any mistakes, any generalizations about this, I apologize. These are some observations that I've gotten from some of my notes. And we are going to focus mostly on Western Africa right here. So let's continue now. Let's talk about the West African oral tradition, which we will spend some time on. Now, traditionally in West Africa, written history was not passed down by books like we would in school. Doesn't mean the history wasn't written down, but just not traditionally passed on by books in the same way we would in our schools. So if we look at this, our history, we would say that it would actually be passed down by an oral tradition or by word of mouth, often accompanied by music, by a wise village elder who will get more in detail when we start talking about the griots. Now, when the language was first written down, our first records that we have are books that were in Arabic. Now you're thinking, Arabic? Wait a minute, Sub-Saharan Africa, why would they be written in Arabic? Well, if we look West Africa again, this region right here of Western Africa, how did they get Arabic here? Well, most of it came from this area here, which we would call Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula. You have Saudi Arabia, many other countries. Iraq would be right around there. We'd have Saudi Arabia here. Now, people from this area in the year 500s, we're going to talk more about this, came in and, for the most part, took over Northern Africa. Some voluntarily, so there was some resistance, but they were able to take over North Africa. Now, they weren't able to take over West Africa, but however, there was strong influence. These kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, which we're going to talk about a little later, many of them became Muslims. The leaders became Muslim by choice, and they took on the religion, and with Islam came Arabic and came books written in Arabic. So if we look around between the years 800 and 1200, we start seeing Arabic coming more and more in the West Africa, and we start seeing books in library. We see this a little bit in Ghana, but especially Mali. When we start talking about Mali, we're going to see lots of books, lots of universities, big cities like Timbuktu, which are international university cities. So the history was written in Arabic. At first, by the non-West Africans who came in, the North Africans or the people from Arabia, but eventually it gets taken over and the Africans write their own books and they write them in Arabic. And these books still exist. They're still in Timbuktu. We're going to watch a video by Henry Louis Gates of Harvard University where he goes out to some of these cities and you get to see some of these books. Now, so from 800 to 1200 and years after that, we see that the books are written in Arabic. Now, later on, these books get written down in French and English. So this goes on between the Europeans. They first come into the Africas around the 1500s bringing in slaves. They don't get very far into Africa at that time. Mainly they're concerned about trying to get resources like gold, get slaves. They really can't go in the interior. Part of the reason is because many Europeans just physically can't handle the interior of Africa. They get sick. Diseases like malaria kill them. And most of them, their business is slaves, is how they make their profits in the slave trade. Now, in the 1800s, they start making their way more into Africa, and then we start seeing some of the history of Africa being written. Now, I want you to think, anytime a history is not written by its people, when it's written by an outsider, is it going to be biased? Is it going to be accurate? It's going to be written, as one student said, mostly by point of view of the Europeans. So I have a book, it's titled Cities and People of the Old and New World. It's an old history book that my cousin actually bought for me at an antique show. I'm going to read part of it, and this is a book, copyright's 1898, so this one is 116 years old now. The title of the chapter is In Darkest Africa. Now, this writer's writing, he had just left Europe, where he's writing glowing stories about the beauty of Paris, London, all the European cities. And now let's read his chapter on Africa, which is titled In Darkest Africa. It is a wonderful thing to start from the civilization of Europe, pass up these mighty rivers and work your way into that unknown land. Work your way alone and on foot, mile after mile, month after month, among strange birds and beasts and plants and insects, meeting tribes which have no name, speaking tongues which no men can interpret, till you've reached its secret heart and stood where the white man has never trod before. Now, I want you to think about what he's saying there. Tribes that have no name. Does that even make sense? So these tribes they never named themselves? Speaking tongues or languages that no one can understand, so are they literally just going back and forth to each other, blah, 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 and not understanding each other? As many students pointed out, well, I think basically what he's really saying is, I can't understand them. I don't know their tribal names. What's that really telling you is the writer of this book just doesn't know what he's seen because he doesn't understand the language, doesn't understand what the people are saying. I'm going to continue, and it gets worse here. If you're not offended, something is wrong. We're going to keep on going here. It is a wonderful thing to look at this weird world of human beings, half animal, half children, wholly savage and wholly heathen, and turn and come back to civilization before the impressions have had time to fade. So he's calling the Africans something between children, heathens, savages, using horrible words. He doesn't know what he's seen. He's just making assumptions based upon what he sees, and he thinks it's barbaric. But he can't even hear the people. He doesn't know that they have a history. He doesn't know they have a story. He doesn't know they have kingdoms. Part of the reason is because he doesn't understand the language, which he pretty much admits earlier, and is misunderstanding what he's seeing around him. Now, Africans do have a story. They do have a history. But the storytellers are mainly what we call the griots, which we're going to get to in a minute. They tell epics, long stories that can go for days. We talked a little about this in Greece and Rome when we talked about the epics of Homer. We talked about the epics of Virgil. Now, the African ones don't have like cyclopses and those things, mostly the griots don't say. They're basically talking about the history of their people. So we're going to move on next, and we're going to talk about the griots, and that's where we're going to start our next lecture.